With me is Professor Agata Bielik-Robson, who's the Professor of Jewish Studies here in the university. And we have had an ongoing discussion about what it means to talk about life. How do we view life? Do we view life as tragic? Do we view life in Messianic terms? Do we view life as something that's opening up to enhancement, or is it looking back to some tragic event? And views of life is Agata's big project at the moment. Tell me a bit about your project.
Well, this project sprang from a comparative study, so to say. Namely, I'm trained as a philosopher, but lately I work mostly in theological domain, Jewish theology, but also in the crossings with Christian theology, obviously. And I've noticed that there is one concept that appears very often in both traditions, but appears in completely different ways, in ways that actually makes them completely disparate and having nothing in common. There is the concept of life. And my purpose now is actually to explore how it is possible that these two discourses, philosophy and theology, sport completely two different notions of life. And maybe this is the true source of their difference, of their discursive irreconcilability. That actually it is very difficult to reconcile philosophical and theological perspective precisely because they operate with very, very different notions of life. And now, what are these notions? Philosophy, because it originated in Greece, has preserved, I think, the originally Greek understanding of life, both as zoe and bios, the organic, natural, biological life, and bios as the human life, always based on the structure of zoe. And it is essentially a tragic notion of life. As Miguel Unamuno, Spanish Catholic philosopher and theologian, called it, it's a tragic sense of life. Life is perceived here in two perspectives, as the singular life and the so-called general life, which is always writ with capital L. This is the kind of life that will be very important for the modern German philosophy, the so-called Lebensphilosophy, the philosophy of life, starting with Nietzsche, then developing through Dilthey, and eventually finding its culmination Heidegger. But this sort of tragic idea of life as divided between the individual and general life makes the individual life always totally dependent on the totality, on the whole. In a way, this is a vision of a sacrificial life. The Greeks perceived the life of the individual creature, of individual being, as actually a process of continuous sacrifice, almost from the moment of its birth. It's a process of continuous dying for the sake of the whole. The main idea, the Greek idea of justice, is a sacrificial idea, which means that the individual must sooner or later give in to the demands of totality. If it's understood, no matter if it's understood in social or ontological terms. As Anaximander, who was a famous pre-Socratic philosopher, put it, every individual being has to go back to the apeiron, which is the infinity, and give back its life, which it never deserved, which in a way was only in sort of hybristic possession. So basically, all these sort of tragic notions of hybris, which is the unduly pride, hamartia, which is a tragic sin, they all refer to the individual life, which is expected to accept death as the justice and right measure of all things, and sacrifice itself for the sake of the whole.
And that sense of, the tragic sense of life, it takes a modern form, something like the theory of the selfish gene, where it's the gene It's the whole. It's the
the
genes that
totality.
survive,
Yes.
and you just happen to be in possession of them, and you're just a moment in the succession of the and success of the gene pool.
Actually, this tragic notion of life establishes a very strong paradigm, a very strong scheme of thinking that is pervasive in the whole Western thought, and that obviously modernity never broke with it, because I just said, I mean, if you look any German philosophy of life, from Nietzsche up to Heidegger, or even Dawkins, or the whole notion of sociobiology, or the selfish gene I've just mentioned, or even Darwin. Darwin is also the best example of this sort of tragic understanding of life, where individual life always has to sacrifice itself for the sake of the bigger process, like evolution.
And what appears to be merely biological description is actually biological description within a very large narrative, which is philosophically driven.
Of course, which means that the whole Greek philosophy, and also with this sort of notion of tragedy, is actually naturalistic. It always takes nature, physis, as its main ground of thinking. In a way, human life is meant to imitate the natural life. Nature is always a pattern to imitate, is always a kind of a definitive pattern which sets the idea of a natural right, a natural law, and whatever is natural is good. This is a kind of a Greek model of thinking, which is obviously opposed by the whole Jewish Messianic tradition, where Christianity, stands very strangely between the camps, so to say, because of the sacrificial death of Christ. It invites a lot of tragic elements, but also it draws from the Jewish Messianic tradition, which sports a completely different notion of life.
Well, actually, it's interesting, before you go into the Messianic view of life, there's an interesting confusion in Christian theology on this, because Christian theology is based on Jesus, an individual, and yet a lot of Christians will say God became a human being in Jesus Christ. It's almost as if Jesus Christ is just a phenomenon of existence rather than the historical existence. Whereas I constantly say, don't say God became man, a generic becoming
Yes.
God becoming a generic thing, man, humanity, life. God became a man, an individual.
A concrete individual.
A concrete individual. So that actually, when Christians talk about God sharing in human life, it's not sharing in this abstract life. It's
exactly.
It's the individual, Jesus. But okay, that's one of my sort of when I meet Christians who inherit this Greek sense, I feel this need to try and correct them and say, no, please put in an article. He became a man. He became this individual. Okay.
That sort of leads me to my next point. That
Good.
actually the Jewish tradition is strictly nominalistic, just to define it in philosophical terms, which means that it shuns generalizations and mistrusts general abstract concepts like life in general, which is a very much Greek way of looking at things. Nominalistic, it means that for the Jewish thought, life, when talking about life, this existential issues, is always an individual life, is always life pertaining to a singular being, is always a life within certain limits of birth and death. It is not a kind of a life that is a fragment of a larger whole. And obviously the whole idea of sacrifice or self-offering is put here completely out of question. The whole messianic thrust, I think, of the Jewish religion is actually to break with this sacrificial, self-offering, tragic circle of life, when you're supposed to think about yourself as a fragment of a larger whole, something that comes to existence, in a way borrows existence from something else, and then is due to give it back, right, in the right time. So the most characteristic feature, I think, of this kind of a Messianic vitalism, as I want to call it, in contrast with the tragic vitalism, that is a tragic notion of life, is that it fosters individual life, but not exactly yet as an eternal life, or rather immortal life. Immortality is an invention of Christianity in this context. Obviously, it is rather an invention of Plato. It is an invention of Hellenistic philosophy, which imposed itself on us in Christianity. But early Jewish thought, something that we can decipher from the Hebrew scriptures, did not really know yet the idea of immortality. It had the idea of life here and now, which was supposed to be intensified and augmented not after death, but before death. When you read David's Psalms and his invocations to life and to living God, Elohim Haim, you'll see that this is a finite life, what he has in mind, but the life which struggles with death. This is a kind of a life that struggles with death and puts itself in a very strong antithesis to death, but not in order to achieve some abstract immortality, but in order to achieve more life here and now on earth. The Messianic ideal of life intensified, augmented and abandoned is actually a very materialistic ideal, not some kind of a spiritual abstract thing. It does not delegate life into the realms of immortality. It wants life to flourish and grow out of the natural cycle of life and death here and now on earth. But the main point of the sort of intensification of life is truly an exodus out of nature. An exodus out of nature understood in this sort of Greek way as this great will, this eternal cycle of becoming and perishing, where all individual lives are always crippled and limited by the organization of the whole.
As a Christian theologian, you remind me once again of three problems that I need to remind myself of every day. The first is the danger of seeing life in this abstract generalization and forgetting that if Christianity has any sense, it's on the historical, it's based on historical action and an individual. But it also reminds me of how easily Christian theologians confuse their belief in resurrection, fullness of life, with simply immortality. In fact, there's a lot of theologians who think immortality of the soul equals resurrection. And the last issue is that sacrifice, ultimately in both our traditions, is praise of God. It's not the knife.
Exactly.
For reminding me of this and sharing your thoughts and giving us an insight into your project, Agata, thanks for coming today.
Thank you.